Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm very glad to meet you. My name is Judy and I love both travel and history. If you enjoy what you see here, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Today we're going to visit Berlin's most famous street, Unter den Linden, strolling from just west of the Museum Island all the way to the Brandenburg Gate. In real life, instead of a virtual stroll, this would require quite a bit of hopping on and off the bus. The distance from the beginning to the end is less than a mile as the crows fly, but the experience distance is going to be far longer. Distances as the crow flies are significant only to crows. So make sure you have your transit pass and your sneakers ready, or just relax and hop on the virtual bus with me today on the Armchair Traveler. Unter den Linden has always been one of the ritziest areas of this city. It's just chock full with shops, restaurants, museums, art venues, and far more. The name actually refers to trees planted on either side of the wide boulevard. Although they're called linden trees, the British call them lime trees, they had nothing to do with citrus. The street and the trees were famous enough that Johann Strauss even penned a waltz about it. Unter den Linden stretches all the way from the Museum Island to the Brandenburg Gate. At the end of World War II, the entire area fell under Soviet control, and later that of its client state, the German Democratic Republic, during which time it remained in a state of considerable disrepair. Since the reunification of the country, it has returned to its previous glory. Frederick II is generally referred to as Frederick the Great, and by all accounts he earned that title. He's been nicknamed Alte Fritz. He was a brilliant military campaigner who managed to completely reorganize the army and, in a series of diplomatic stratagems and wars against Austria and other powers, greatly enlarged Prussia's territories and made Prussia the foremost military power in Europe. He was also, for his time and circumstances, a symbol not just of military might, but of enlightened government, which was becoming an influential idea throughout much of Europe. He wasn't enlightened enough to give up his privileged position in society, but he was remarkably enlightened nevertheless, especially in comparison to those around him. Alte Fritz was notably out of favor with both the Nazis, who probably detested his ideas of tolerance, the post-World War II East Germans, who disassembled his statue and were going to melt it down and make pennies out of it, and certainly the Soviets, who had good reason to fear the heirs of the military he had created. Just below Alte Fritz, in the image, you can see the four virtues, and below that images of people who were important family members or collaborators. If I knew more German history, I could read Alte Fritz's life story and the story of his country, at least as he wanted me to understand it, from this rather large chunk of metal. This most important of Berlin's streets started out as a bridle path used by the royal family and their hangers-on to ride between the royal palace and their private hunting grounds in the Tiergarten, which we'll visit next time. Later on, the bridle path was replaced by a wide street bordered by linden trees, which is how it got its name. The painting you see here was created in 1853. It shows what the area might have looked like in those days. The statue in the lower right is that of Frederick the Great, surveying his domain. In front of him, on the right-hand side of the street, you can see first the opera building and then a domed building, which was the city palace where he lived. This modern image shows Unter den Linden from the viewpoint of Frederick the Great, the statue you see on the left-hand side. You can clearly make out the enormous eyesore and landmark that is the East German TV tower in the distance. I like to think that Frederick is looking down his nose at that blight on his beloved city. Zeughaus was an arsenal designed by Frederick William III's favorite architect, Andreas Schleuder. We met him previously for his work in and around the Museum Island. This is the oldest surviving building on the street and houses the German Historical Museum. In its day, as an arsenal, it displayed cannons from Brandenburg and Prussia. Today, the building, along with the stunning addition designed by I.M. Pei and shown on the right, houses the German Historical Museum. The website tells me that, sadly, the permanent exhibition in the museum is closed. I'm not sure whether that means just for now or permanently. I'm in high hopes it'll reopen by the time I arrive. Bebelplatz is a newer name for this square. It was originally called Frederick's Forum, and housed both the State Opera and St. Hedwig's. These were important symbols not just of the arts but of tolerance, as we'll see in our next stop. The square, unfortunately, wasn't always a site of either tolerance or artistic merit. On May 10, 1933, shortly after the Nazis grabbed control of all elements of the government, this was the site of one of the first of the Nazi book burnings. Members of the Nazi German Student Union and their professors enthusiastically burned books as part of a nationwide action against the un-German spirit. What they were really trying to incinerate was any idea or notion that anyone could oppose the will of the Nazi Party and survive. Hitler reportedly chose this square deliberately. It was built by Frederick the Great to embody culture and enlightenment, to demonstrate symbolically that that era of tolerance and openness was now over. I'd say he succeeded. The opening into the bottom of the square that you see on the right is a monument to the book burning. In my Museum Island video, I mentioned that Reunited Berlin's plan for the Museum Island was to turn it into a kind of Louvre on the Spree, a display of culture, art, learning, and tolerance. This wasn't the only time that the rulers of Germany attempted to do those things. What is now called Bebelplatz was the home not just of the State Opera, but of St. Hedwig's Cathedral. This Catholic church was built with the agreement of Frederick the Great, here in the heart of Protestant Prussia. It was Berlin's only Catholic house of worship until 1854, and is the oldest Roman Catholic church in the diocese. The church became an important resistance center during World War II. The head prelate, Father Bernhard Lichtenberg, headed an opposition movement. He died while being deported to Dachau in 1943 and is today buried in the crypt. St. Hedwig stands to this day as a symbol of Frederick the Great's religious and cultural tolerance. This pragmatic king wanted to encourage the integration of Catholic Silesians. Sadly, it appears that almost nothing of the original building remains. The cathedral was severely damaged by Allied bombing on March 1, 1943. Only the damaged shell of the building was left standing. Reconstruction started in 1952 and dragged on until 1963, when the new high altar was finally consecrated. Modernization had been happening since the 19th century, when the carvings you see here in the pediment were probably added. After World War II, the dome had to be replaced as well as the interior. The building, like all of Unter and Linden, was under East German control. Now that the city has been reunited, the building is closed indefinitely for major renovations. The Neue Wache, or New Guard Tower, dates originally from the early 1800s. It was a barracks for bodyguards assigned to the royal palace. After the monarchy was abolished at the end of World War I, the building was repurposed into a memorial for fallen soldiers. Check out that pediment over the doorway. The goddess of victory stands in the center, appropriately in my opinion, amid the chaos of war, as soldiers fall around her. The interior of this building has been modified and repurposed several times. In 1957, the East German authorities had it rebuilt and reopened in 1960 as a memorial to the victims of fascism and militarism, with the decorations you can see on the left. In 1969, 20th anniversary of the East German state, they installed a glass prism with an eternal flame in the center of the hall. The remains of an unknown soldier and of a nameless Nazi concentration camp victim were enshrined in the building. After the German reunification, the Neue Wache was again modified and rededicated in 1993 as a central memorial of the Federal Republic of Germany for the victims of war and tyranny. The interior was redecorated at the personal suggestion of the then Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl. He had them remove all the East German decorations and replace them with an enlarged version of Kathe Kollwitz's famous sculpture, Mother with Her Dying Son. The statue sits directly under the opening of the dome, which is called an oculus. The idea was to expose it to rain, snow, and cold, just like civilians had suffered in Berlin during World War II. The absolutely hateful Berlin Wall was pitched up first of barbed wire and then of something a lot sturdier. The right side of the wall in this view is wildly decorated. That would have been the side that pointed toward West Berlin. To the left you can see the remains of the no man's land maintained after the wall was built. The barbed wire original wall wasn't enough to stop desperate East Berliners, nor was the concrete wall from making a run for freedom. The East Germans installed a killing field as well. This hateful relic is mostly gone, although reunified Germany has retained bits and pieces of it, perhaps as a reminder of what happened to them and could easily happen again. Why did the Germans put up the wall in the first place? The East Germans and their Soviet masters noticed that many educated, skilled people were fleeing from all over Germany into West Berlin. Brain drain was the issue. West Berlin, although inside of East Germany, and the capital of nothing, was a tiny and extremely frightening example of productive capitalism. Its very existence was a denunciation of the East Germans and the Soviets and their loopy economic and political ideology. East Berliners and their Soviet masters, and nothing happened in East Berlin without Soviet approval, decided to put a stop to it, and the wall was their method. It was part of an experiment to see what happens when you divide a city and let one side prosper while the other side withers. East Berlin was the result. 40 years later, the West Berliners and the West German government are still paying to rectify the damage. This photo shows an image of the Brandenburg Gate with Napoleon at the top in what was then called Viereck, or the square. The square was, as I mentioned, one of the fanciest and most important ones in the city until World War II. During that war, Allied bombing left it a crater-pocked wasteland on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall, which ran through the Brandenburg Gate to get any rebuilding. On the bottom left is a square being rebuilt after the city was reunited. The right image shows a part of the square and the Brandenburg Gate today. The Brandenburg Gate is one of the most famous spots along the former Berlin Wall, but it was a tourist destination long before that wall was built. On our next visit to the Tiergarten, which remained in the western part of the city, I'll show you what it looked like from there and a few of the more famous events that occurred in its shadow. If the Brandenburg Gate looks a bit familiar, it should. It was inspired in part by the Parthenon. The gate was pitched up in just 3 years, from 1788 to 1791, on the side of one of the gates in the original city wall. At the top, you'll see the Quadriga, a sculpture of the goddess of victory mounted atop 4 horses. You might not think that a copper-plated piece of iron could move around, but it did. After his victories at Jena and Auerstadt, Napoleon rode in triumph into Berlin, passing under this gate. The Quadriga apparently caught the general's eye. He had it stolen. Of course, this wasn't the only thing the French liberated from the Germans, or later on the Germans liberated from the French, but this particular piece of vandalism stuck in the Germans' collective craw. The Germans wanted their horses back. After 1814, they managed to force their way into Paris, led by elements of the Prussian army. The army seized the statue and hustled it back to Berlin. This was a former symbol of the divided city as well. It drew visitors who used to climb an observation platform in order to get a glimpse of the world beyond the Iron Curtain on the other or eastern side of the barren death strip. It was here, in 1987, that Ronald Reagan issued his stern command to his Cold War adversary, admonishing him with these words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The Reichstag is the heart, once again, of Germany's government, and is where the Bundestag, which is rather like our House of Representatives, meets. It is new by European standards. Perhaps this is because modern Germany didn't exist before 1871. The building opened in 1895. In late February 1933, it was burnt nearly to the ground in the Reichstag fire. The Nazi leadership and its coalition partners used the fire to claim that communists were planning a violent uprising. In truth, when they accused others, they were actually pointing out what they had in mind. They claimed that emergency legislation was needed to stop this. The resulting act, commonly known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, abolished a number of constitutional protections and paved the way for total Nazi dictatorship. Who really burnt it down? Historians are going to argue about this one until the end of time, and it is always possible that evidence will emerge now that the two Germanys have been reunited and all the files are available for study. But one common theory is the arson had been planned and ordered by the Nazis as a false flag operation. What remained of the building was badly damaged in the final siege of Berlin at the end of World War II, and it remained in disuse. The Germans all neglected it. The West German government met in Bonn and had no reason to fix it up, and the East German government met a couple of miles east in what they called the Palace of the Republic. After the reunification of the country, however, money flowed like Riesling to rebuild it. Among other things, the architect replaced the old dome, you can see that in the before photo, with something much grander. This is a view of the interior of that much grander Reichstag dome I just mentioned. The dome really is fabulous, and I think it might be worth my effort to visit. An ordinary person can tour the Reichstag, but you must make a reservation, answer a bunch of security questions, and go through some pretty serious security screening. Since it's part of the seat of government, I think all of this is quite reasonable. However, it does cost. There is a fee for visiting. Even so, I think it would be worth the effort, particularly if I can manage to go on a clear day. The view from the dome is spectacular. It might be even better at night. There is an option to just paying to visit the dome. There's a ritzy, fine dining restaurant at the top. I looked at the menu and I think the vibe is more or less like the old Windows of the World. Cheap it is not, but worthwhile it just might be, at least for a treat meal. We'll visit here at the end of our walk. The term prix fixe is French. The idea exists all over Europe and goes by the same name in Germany. Generally, a prix fixe meal has several courses and usually includes an appetizer, an entree, and a dessert, often with wine or coffee. It's almost always a great value, providing you want a full meal. Often, the whole shebang will set you back less than the regular cost of one main course item. Berlin is a world-class capital with many fine dining establishments. This scenic rooftop restaurant sits on top of the Reichstag, and the location screams tourist trap to me, but I'm always willing to be fair and give a place a look and check the reviews. All the reviews of the food suggested it was excellent. Most of the negative reviews complained about the high prices. Called Kafer, the last time I checked, it was 28 euros. You get a lot more, however, than just a couple of courses and a beverage. You get a killer view of the entire city. You absolutely have to make a reservation in advance since the place is so popular. The name, incidentally, means beetle, like a bug or the car. I have absolutely no idea why any restaurant would name itself after a bug or a car. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen